Okay, let's start. Welcome to the Jackson Hole China Forum. Today is Friday. It's Friday late afternoon. I'm so glad you can make it. And the weather is not that beautiful, but hopefully we get some rain. And we are very delighted today. We have a very distinguished scholar from Hoover Institution at Stanford University, Dr. Tai Chun Kuo. She received her education in the U.S. many years ago. I don't know how many years ago. Then she went back to Taiwan and worked with Taiwan government and in a variety of positions. In fact, she was the press secretary to President Lee Teng-hui when he was still the president of Taiwan. And also he was the deputy director general of the presidential office. They have a bureaus. One of the bureaus, I don't remember what bureau she was. 6 bureaus. Foreign affairs. Political affairs bureau at the presidential office in Taiwan's government. Then she was sent overseas to be the director general of government information office in Boston. And from there, I think she went back to academia and worked in Taiwan's Tamkang University, where there are a lot of former KMT government officials gathered when they lost their jobs in the government, when the regime change took place, the DPP came to power, then KMT people lost their power, then they had found jobs. The universities were one of those places they can be. I think she was one of the former senior government officials found a position in academia. Then she was then recruited by the Hoover Institution at the US to be a research fellow. Since then, she has been working on many issues. But one of her most, I think, well-known and important accomplishments was her role to negotiate with the Chiang Kai-shek's family to move when Madame Chiang Kai-shek was about passing away, to negotiate to keep those very valuable, very treasured diaries of Chiang Kai-shek in the U.S. instead of sending back to Taiwan, because at that time they were concerned if those diaries sent back to Taipei, the DPP government would treat them with the way they're supposed to be. So in that context, those very valuable historical documents were kept as archives in Hoover Institution. And she played a very important role and helped to launch the archive program, which since then had been opened to the public. I heard a lot about the Chiang Kai-shek diary in both China and Taiwan, people talking about that. And a lot of scholars have went to Hoover Institution just for those diaries, to do research, reading them, and found a lot of new information which were not available before those diaries were open to the public. So we are so honored, so delighted that Dr. Tai Chun Kuo came to talk about one part of the diary that is still in the wall with Japan in 1930s and 40s. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Dr. Kuo. Okay, sit here.
Thank you so much, Jason. We've been good friends for so many years. I just don't remember how
We're all old now.
So when you ask me how many years I received my doctorate degree, 30 years.
Oh wow, okay. You look so much younger.
And I'm very glad to be here, ladies and gentlemen, to share with you my understanding and findings, exciting findings about Chiang Kai-shek diary. this is Chiang Kai-shek in his 20s. This was taken in Dongjing when he was a student in Dongjing, and this was taken in, I guess it was in 1924-25, when he was Commander-in-Chief of Huangpu Military Academy. And this picture was taken in 1945, and that was about the end of the World War II. Chiang Kai-shek was Commander-in-Chief of China Theater. And this is Chiang Kai-shek and in his senior age. For all his life, he was a nice looking person. Chiang Kai-shek, you know that he was chairman of Kuomintang from 1938 to 1975, the year he died. And he was first president of the Republic of China, second, third, fourth, and fifth president of the Republic of China. There are a lot of jokes about his being in that position for so many years. We don't have time to get into that. Today, I'd like to share with you about Chiang Kai-shek diaries and the stories revealed. Chiang Kai-shek started to write his diary in 1915, and he stopped writing in 1972 when he was hospitalized. And many scholars came to Hoover to check his diary, to use his diary, and they found that he didn't miss any single day. For all his life, he wrote diary every day. But here at Hoover, we preserve his diaries from 1917 to 1972, 55 years, with year 1924 missing. We have 66 volumes altogether, because for some years there are 2 volumes. He wrote his diary every day, and he wrote weekly review, monthly review, weekly reflections, monthly reflections, yearly reflections. And there were a lot of notes, newspaper clippings, along with the diary. So we're talking about his diaries, we're talking about like 200, 300, maybe 400 million Chinese characters. So it's gigantic quantities, huge collections of his diary. Huang Renyu, late professor of Columbia University, and he said, because of Jiang's position as leader of China before 1949 in China and after 1949 till 1975 in Taiwan, because of his position, so his diaries were so unique, and in regard to his huge quantity and extreme importance, they are definitely the only one of its kind. This is definitely true. And this is the diaries. When they first arrived at Hoover Institution, archived, some of the diaries were broken, damaged, damped, and many of the pages stick together, and they were just like pieces of bricks, and we cannot open them. So Hoover technicians use their technology, expertise, and patience to repair the diaries. And now we have the microfilm and digitized. So this is the diary of 1926. And you can see loose page. And this is his diary of 1931, right after the 9/18事变, September 18 incident. And here you can see, we can read like 此次对日不再战斗之胜负. This was right after the 9/18 incident. And he wrote in his diary saying that the significance of our war against the Japanese invasion is not a matter of winning or loss, but to show our nation's dignity and spirit, because he knew there was no way to win. And so with lots of new documents, we're not talking about Chiang Kai-shek diaries, because in the past 5 years, there are many other valuable documents coming into Hoover. For example, TV Soong, papers, Kong Xiangxi, H.H. Kong papers. Song Ziwen, Kong Xiangxi were brothers-in-law to Jiang Jieshi. Song Ziwen used to be China's finance minister, foreign minister, premier, and governor of Guangdong. He was Chiang Kai-shek's special representative during the war in Washington and New York. Kong Xiangxi, his family was believed to be one of the richest family in China. And Kong Xiangxi was finance minister, foreign minister, vice premier, and premier. And many other people, new private papers of many other important persons. But with new documents unveiled, definitely there are new findings, new interpretations. So all these materials altogether come to unlock our understanding of modern China history, reconstructing historical events and presenting evidence. And all those new records illustrate much information that we never know, and they challenge our understanding of the history. For example, take Sino-Japanese War, 中日战争, as an example. Sino-Japanese War, this is actually the second Sino-Japanese War. And the first one was taken 100 years ago, 甲午战争. So Western people used to say the second Sino-Japanese War. This war is the best, the most important historical event for Chinese state and people in the 20th century. It started with the 9/18, September 18 incident, when Japanese troops took Manchuria and established the Empire of Manchu. But what's interesting to find was that right after the 1931 September 18 incident, Chiang Kai-shek in his diary, he said, how am I going to fight with it? What should I do with it? China has no way to win. Japan was so modernized, so advanced, and China was so backward, poor, and weak. How can we fight against such a strong enemy? So he decided to keep a low key for this event. That's after the 1931 9/18 Manchuria incident. But we found in his diary, for the Qiqi Shibian, the July 7 Marco Polo Bridge incident of 1937, he changed his attitude. Because right after the Marco Polo Bridge incident of 1937, which is 6 years after the Manchuria incident, the leader of northern China, General Soong was about to reach a peaceful resolution with Japan, but Chiang Kai-shek refused it. As a matter of fact, he broke the agreement because according to the agreement, China and Japan will withdraw their troops from northern China. But China should withdraw its troops first, then Japan will do it. But Chiang Kai-shek claimed several principles saying that we have to withdraw at the same time, with a mutual withdrawal. And secondly, any resolution, any agreement reached by General Soong and the Japanese soldiers should not jeopardize China's sovereignty. And there shouldn't be any replacement of personnel, and there shouldn't be any change of the current regulations, etc., etc. And any agreement reached between General Soong and Japan should not violating the regulations and laws issued by Chinese central government. Instead of withdrawing his troops, Jiang stationed more troops to Hebei, to northern China, to Baodi, which of course broke the agreement. And Japan, of course, very angry. So Japan keeps sending more troops into northern China, and that brought out the war into a full wing. So now question is, why? Why did he keep a low key after the 1931 Manchuria incident, but keep such a strong stand and after the 1937 Marco Polo Bridge incident. What is any factors that make him the change? And why didn't he receive the peaceful agreement that was about to be signed by General Soong and the Japanese soldiers? And interesting is, 1 month after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Chiang Kai-shek initiated Soong战争, Shanghai Battle of Shanghai, in Shanghai. He initiated, he provoked the war. Why? So all this mysterious stuff needs to be a logical explanation. But if we have a chance to get access to his diary, reading his minds and trying to get into his decision making, then we find that he had his concern, he had his reasons to do this. For example, on September 18, 1931, the Manchuria incident, Chiang Kai-shek was not even aware of it. He was in Jiangxi. I know many Chinese, in Chinese mainland, and many leftist journals claims that Chiang Kai-shek was the person who ordered Young Marshal Zhang Xueliang to withdraw, who ordered Young Marshal Zhang Xueliang not to fight against the Japanese invasion. And this is untrue. Zhang Xueliang admitted it many times. The decision not to fight against the Japanese invasion was made by himself. Chiang Kai-shek was not even aware of the incident. It was the next day, September 19, he was informed of the incident. But nevertheless, the day has finally come, because Japan for a long time have been planning for invasion of China. They did a lot of survey about China. They had a lot of preparation. They learned Chinese language. They sent a lot of intelligence people to China, especially Manchuria and the northern China, investigating the road, the railroad, river, etc., etc. They've been prepared for many years to invade China. But Japan's plan was not to fight in China. Japan was planning to take advantage of China being divided by warlords. So Japan was planning to divide China and rule. Japan wants to control Chinese resources. Japan's real enemy was not China, never was China. Japan actually didn't take China seriously. Japan looked down of China. Japan's enemy was Soviet Russia. But in order to fight Soviet Russia, Japan had to control China, make sure that its backward was quiet and safe, and at the same time control China's resources. And China at that time, you all know that China was divided by warlords. Chiang Kai-shek, for all his life, was never been able to control China. To the most of his sovereignty, 7 provinces in eastern coast: Fujian, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Hubei, Hunan, Anhui. 7 provinces. Chiang Kai-shek had never got real control over China. So that was Japan's plan, to divide China and rule. So what would Chinese do? People like Chiang Kai-shek and Wang Jingwei. Wang Jingwei was the second, at that time was the leader of the party, and also he was 行政院院长. Wang Jingwei, he was prime minister, premier, and also celebrities, government leaders, academia leaders, media leaders, celebrities, Wang Jingwei, Hu Shi, Yu Youren, Cai Yanpei, they all understood very well that China had no way to fight against Japanese invasion, because it was an unequal context. So everybody was just saying, 这个仗怎么打? How are we going to fight this war? 这个仗怎么打? Wang Jingwei, every day, every time during Kuomintang meeting, Wang Jingwei said, 这个仗怎么打? how are we going to fight this war? So Wang Jingwei and some of people, they just stress that we should be tolerant, we should be quiet, enduring, and let's keep a low profile. So Wang Jingwei and some of his people be labeled as 低调俱乐部, low profile club. In Chiang Kai-shek's diary also, he knew it very well. He said China is not matched to Japan. Japan can conquer China in 3 days. And another day he said, oh, Japan can conquer China in 3 months. Why he meant by 3 days? He meant saying that Japan could easily control the eastern coast and blockade the eastern coast of China. So then China will have nowhere to go but perish. And he said there is no defeat, no victory, only defeat but no victory. He said nobody would presume that China would be able to fight against Japan. But the war is unavoidable, because Chiang Kai-shek wrote in his diary that the war between China and Japan is inevitable. Japan wants China perished. And one day he wrote, he said that I know very well that there will be inevitable a war between China and Japan, because Japan wants our resources, our military, economic, industrial resources, and the life of our nation as well. And he said Japan, at that time when he wrote this diary, Japan already controlled Manchuria and northern China. And he said Japan will never be contented with the control of Manchuria and northern China. Japan wants to control the whole China. So he said in his diary, this is an unequal contest. And if we proceed in haste, then defeat is the only destiny. So he wrote in his diary, and the diary I just showed you, that the significance of the war is not a matter of winning or loss, but a demonstration of our national spirit and dignity. You know, by so saying, you know that he didn't expect a victory. He knew that they had to deal with it, but he really didn't know what to do. He needed time to think about it, and he needed time to prepare for the war. But he was actually trying to prepare for the war, even though at that time in 1931, 32, and 33, he didn't have any idea what to do. He sent TV Soong, H.H. Kong, Jiang Tingfu, and Chen Yi to United States, to United Kingdom, Soviet, to Western countries, trying to get foreign support. And at the same time, he tried to build highway, roadway, and trying to do infrastructure. And in 1934, he launched 新生活运动, New Life Movement. So it looked like a social education movement. But in reality, in his diary, he said, I did this for the preparation of the war. I had a talk at Wuhan University last year, and I mentioned about 新生活运动, this new life movement. And I said it was actually part of Chiang's preparation for the war. And one history professor at Wuhan University, he was surprised. He said, wow, for so many years, I wrote about New Life Movement, and I taught students about New Life Movement, and I thought it was just a social movement. I never figured out that it was actually a movement to prepare for a war. And Kong Xiangxi, Chiang Kai-shek's brother-in-law, successfully signed a contract, a secret accord with Germany, because German was the similar situation. German, defeated after the World War I, and Germany was frustrated, and they were, trying to have a comeback. That was 1933. They signed the secret accord entitled China Minerals and German Industrial Exchange Program. So by such an exchange program, Germany got China's mineral resources, and in return, Germany sent their military advisors, and Germany gave China ammunition factories, weapons, and other industrial equipment to China. And Germany even sent their former chief of staff, General Sect, it's a three-star general, as KMT's head military advisor, chief military advisor. And another general, Falkenhausen, he went to China as Chinese chief advisor to Chiang Kai, military advisor to Chiang Kai-Chek. General Falkenhausen stayed in China until the outbreak of the World War II, until Germany invaded Poland. So he returned to Germany in 1939. So General Falkenhausen was one of the war criminals in 1945, after the war. But Chiang Kai-shek saved his life. Chiang Kai-shek sent the alliance his private letter, because General Falkenhausen had great contribution to Chinese. So, since German military advisor arrived in China, Chiang Kai-shek discussed with German advisors almost every day, what to do, what shall we do, how can we try to fight against the Japanese invasion. And they planned to spend 6 years trying to equip 80 divisions in 6 years, 80 divisions with German equipment. And in 1936, it was 2 years after German advisors arrived in China, and Chiang Kai-shek said that we have to endure, we have to be tolerant, trying to keep a low fire, hiding our intention. If Japan cannot defeat China in 3 years, we would be muster enough might to counterbalance it. But for now, we must endure and hide our time, and endure and bid our time. But at the same time, in 1934, the picture became clear. After numerous discussions with German military advisors, as well as Chinese advisors, and one famous general, Jiang Baili Jiangjun was one of a very key person. And so up to 1934, the picture was about to be finalized, that they had a grand strategy to fight against the Japan invasion. General Falkenhausen surrounded a proposal to Chiang Kai-shek in 1934, in which he stressed 3 principles. 1, try to avoid military confrontation in the coastal areas, and try to relocate the government to the southwestern area. And they thought about Xi'an, they thought about Luoyang, but then decided Chongqing. But how to do it? General Falkenhausen suggests that China must try its best to change Japanese attack route, Japanese military's route of attack. And the second principle General Falkenhausen wrote in his proposal, saying that it's the willpower that really matters, the determination, and the willpower of people, and not only the people's willpower, but the leaders' willpower. You know, what he didn't say is, what do you have, China? What does China have? Nothing but willpower. China was poor, weak, fragile, divided, backward, and 90% of its population was illiterate. So what could China do? So it's the willpower. If Chiang Kai-shek would be able to consolidate people's willpower, and as well as his own, then they could probably try to manage a war against the Japanese invasion. And the third principle was a protracted war. You see, these 3 principles actually they connected with each other, because they want to avoid direct military confrontation in coastal area. So try to attract Japanese soldiers into the mountain area, and try to move the government offices to move important factories into southwestern area. So China has to figure out a protective war against Japan. So trying to use China's vast, huge area to buy time. So in beginning 1934 in Chiang Kai-Chek diary, an interesting phrases began to come out, and because he wanted to reallocate the capital to Sichuan, to Chongqing, but Chiang Kai-Chek had never been able to enter south and western area. His Zhongyang-jun, his troops, were never able to enter Sichuan, Yunnan, Guizhou. But how was he going to do? Then in his diary, he said, I must try to figure out a way how I can send my troops into Sichuan. And one day he said, I could try to fight the Red Armies, disguising my real intention by fighting Red Armies. So if you look at the Long March, the route of the Long March, in year of 1933, there were only 25,000 Red Armies. Chiang Kai-shek probably didn't take it serious because another fighting could perish them. So Chiang Kai-shek deliberately chasing the Red Army, pushing them southwestward into Sichuan, Yunnan, Guizhou, and then from Yunnan, Guizhou, they went to Yan'an. So if you look at the route, it was like this. So by chasing the Red Army, Chiang Kai-shek's troop was able to enter Sichuan, Yunnan, Guizhou, the southwestern part of China. So lots of sentences in his diary. He says, stabilizing southwest. Stabilizing means grabbing control southwest. Stabilizing the southwest by fighting the communists. So his first internal pacification, then external resistance, 攘外必先安内. The targets were, of course, Chinese Red Army, communists. But at that time, in year 1933, 34, 36, it was not the Red Army. It was the warlords. Because Sichuan, Yunnan, Guizhou were controlled by the warlords. So this is the only way Chiang Kai-shek could able try to send his troops into Sichuan, Yunnan, Guizhou. In his diary, he wrote, fighting off the warlords in Sichuan, Guizhou to establish a base in the southwest is a viable path to disguise our intent to go to war with Japanese. And then at the same time, trying to use China's huge space to trade for time. So, 诱日军南下，陷日军于中国内陆. Such sentences like stretching Japanese supply lines and bogging down Japanese soldiers in the vast of Chinese interior. Such an idea began to come out in 1933-34. So up to 1934, Chiang Kai-shek and his military advisors were clear. They had a clear picture, a clear scheme of what they could do and what they should do. Number one, avoid a premature war against Japan, because China was weak backward and unable to fight against Japan. Any premature act of war would spell disaster for China. At the same time, wait. Wait for what? Wait for international support. Wait for a change of international communities. Chiang Kai-shek first waited for Soviet interference. But Stalin, Stalin was just old fox. Stalin keep telling Chiang Kai-shek, saying, hey, hang out, don't worry, I will enter, we'll be there soon. But for so many years, until 1941, until the Pearl Harbor and Stalin, and it's true, didn't step into Chinese territory. So Chiang Kai-shek was very disappointed, frustrated. But until 1941, he was claiming, he was criticizing the Soviet Union, and he was hoping United States and United Kingdom would step in to interfere. But unfortunately, Europe was busy with its own problem. So Chiang Kai-shek in his diary, he said, China should be skillful and cautious in playing between the Soviet and Japan. So his main strategy for dealing with Japanese invasion could be illustrated by this quote. Pacify Japan to disguise our diplomatic efforts. Build transportation infrastructure to disguise our military deployment. Develop industries to disguise our economic mobilization. And educate the masses. Here he meant 新生活运动, New Life Movement. Educate the masses to enhance our defense building. Only by keeping a low profile and hiding our capacities, our intention, we have a chance to defend ourselves. But trying to play a low profile is not easy. It's difficult. Chiang Kai-shek had to receive tremendous criticism, mistrust from students, from intellectuals, from leftist writers, and sometimes even from Kuomintang members. So he wrote in his diary saying that 如苦寒心，含冤忍辱，对外有可，对内有难. Bearing the greatest misunderstanding and humiliation that he wouldn't fight against Japan. It's very hard, but I can manage the external pressure, external criticism that I could stand. But the internal mistrust has taken me outrageous. And how unfortunate that I have the sole burden for my party and my country. He was suffering almost every day, blaming, complaining, the burden, the criticism, mistrust for his not being launching a war against the Japanese invasion. But he wrote right after the signature of Tamkang University, he wrote, the mistrust bestowed to me helped to preserve the country. Revealing my intentions would bring us imminent defeat. I should have courage in facing of this. I should have courage in facing the humiliations for the benefit of China as long as my conscience is clear. Chiang Kai-shek is a person like that guilty. Whenever he was suffering setback and frustration, and he had his way to encourage himself, he always said, 天将降大任于斯也，必先苦其心志，劳其筋骨. When the great person was endowed great responsibilities, and the God would test him with difficulties. So he was actually quietly, skillfully prepared for the war. Now, back to the question, why Chiang Kai-shek was tolerant the 1931 Manchuria incident, but not the 1937 Marco Polo incident. One major reason was the Xi'an incident. Remember, Chiang was planning to spend 6 years to build 80 division of German-equipped troops, but that dream didn't come true. At the breakout of Xi'an incident, only 30 division troops were ready equipped. But with the Xi'an incident, Chiang made a compromise, negotiated a compromise with Zhang Xueliang, Yang Huchen, and with Chinese communists to stop internal war and unite against Japanese invasion. So after the Xi'an incident, the outbreak of Sino-Japanese war was just a matter of time. But the Marco Polo Bridge incident was just served as igniter of the war. Because at that time, General Soong was and the Japanese soldier, they were negotiating a peace agreement. But Chiang Kai-shek worried that northern China would be specialized by Japanese. Because according to the draft, that Japan was going to control northern China, 华北特殊化, specializing northern China, which means it was part of Japan's grand plan. After the Manchuria, then it's northern China. So Manchuria was already an empire, and then now specializing northern China, trying to have northern China separate from Chinese central government. And the next target would be eastern, Huadong, eastern China. So Chiang Kai-shek worried about northern China be specialized, worried that it would be separated from China. So he thought this was the bottom of my tolerance. So I cannot make any concession. So that's why he sent his troops to Hubei, to northern China. Instead of withdrawing the troops, he sent more troops into northern China. And of course, Japanese was very angry. And in response to Chiang Kai-shek's action, Japanese stationed more and more troops into northern China and attacked the Beiping and the Tianjin. So that was the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War. But the war was still limited in a controllable limit. A month later, Chiang Kai-shek initiated another war, which was far more huge, brutal, in Shanghai. 淞沪会战，淞沪会战 but talking about 1937 Shanghai battle, we have to have some understanding of the 1932, the first Shanghai battle. The 1932 first Shanghai battle, that was actually after the Manchu incident. Japanese invaded Shanghai. But at that time, United States and the United Kingdom, they intervened. So they signed a contract with the guarantee of United States and the United Kingdom, saying that neither Japan nor China would send its troops to Shanghai, because Shanghai, with a lot of foreigners living in Shanghai, English concession, American concession, French concession, and Japanese concession, etc., etc. So only with limited amount of Marines to protect overseas, but not to have any combat troops in Shanghai. But on October 12th, Chiang Kai-shek ordered General Zhang Zhizhong to send 2 divisions, about 22,000 soldiers, to Shanghai. By so doing, he broke the agreement. At that time, there were only 6,000, probably less than 6,000 Japanese Marines in Shanghai. Less than 6,000 Japanese Marines, which proves Japan did not intend to have a war in Shanghai. Japan never thought of having a war in Shanghai. It was Chiang Kai-shek who broke the agreement. He sent his troops to Shanghai. And Chiang Kai-shek not only sent his troops in Shanghai, and on the next day, October 13, he ordered Zhang Zhizhong's troops to attack Hongkou. Hongkou is Japanese concession, to attack Hongkou Japanese Marines. So that was the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War. And for many years, Kuomintang declined. They said, oh no, we didn't initiate. It was Japan who invaded China. I believe all of you, all the Chinese people believe that it was Japan who invaded Shanghai, right? Dr. Zhao, right?
Yes.
Yeah, including myself. Until I read the Chiang Kai-shek diary. In his diary, he said, he used the word provoke. He ordered General Zhang Zhizhong to enter Shanghai. By such an action is a violation of the agreement. And in his diary, he said, things to do, blockade Wusong Kou. Wusong Kou is Yangtze Huangpu Yangtze Kou. In his diary, he said, I have determined to blockade Yangtze River estuary. What does that mean? How could he blockade the Yangtze River? How could he do that? He was, intentionally trying to provoke the Japanese, trying to initiate a war against Japan. And he warned General Zhang Zedong to be careful. Say, you must be careful not to provoke recklessly. You must be careful to provoke skillfully. Almost every day in August, every day he checked with General Zhang Zedong, what is your preparation? Did you do that? Did you send your troop to Hongkou? Hongkou was Japanese concession. Are you ready for the blockade of Yangtze River? So, of course, Japanese was very angry. And the Japanese, at the first there were only 6,000 Japanese Marines. But with 22 Chinese soldiers in Hongkou, Japanese sent another 20,000 soldiers to Shanghai. And Chiang Kai-shek sent more troops to Shanghai. Japanese sent more troops to Shanghai. And in China at that time, altogether, Japan had about 100,000 troops in China. So Japan had to deploy its troops from Korea, and Japan had to send its troops from Manchuria to Shanghai, and that was still not enough. So Japan sent 60,000 troops from Taiwan to Shanghai for the Shanghai battle. And you know how many troops Chiang Kai-shek sent? How many troops Chiang Kai-shek dropped in Shanghai battle? 19 divisions, 750,000 troops. And the Battle of Shanghai lasted almost 3 months, from August 13 to November 8th. More than 250 Chinese soldiers died, severely injured. And Japan, they sent 370,000 troops to Shanghai, and more than 50,000 died and seriously injured. If you were Japan, what would you feel? Japan was outrageous. Number one, Chiang Kai-shek forced Japan's plan or conspiracy was to have China divided and controlled. But Chiang Kai-shek forced Japan to engage into a military combat, into a military confrontation. And Japan didn't plan to have a war, didn't plan to fight in China. But Chiang Kai-shek forced Japan to fight in China. Japan's idea was Manchuria. Imagine here is a map of China. Japan conquered Manchuria. And then northern China. It was almost controlled northern China. So Japan was ready to take Pinghan Tianlu, Beiping, Hankou railway. So it was like this to southwest of China and divide China into two. Then China was almost perished. And then Japan will individually negotiate with Chinese warlords. That's Japan's ideal. But by initiating the Battle of Shanghai, Chiang Kai-shek would just make Japan's conspiracy come into the air. So Japan was very angry, let alone such a huge casualties by Japan. So after Shanghai, the city next to Shanghai is what? Nanjing. This is why there was a Nanjing massacre. Japan soldiers were so disappointed, so angry. And we check in scholars using Japanese material. So Japan didn't want to fight in Shanghai. But the war was already there, so they had to send their troops, keep sending more and more troops there. And in internal discussion of Japanese cabinet, they said, okay, all right, Chiang Kai-shek wants a war, we give him a war. Now we send our troops there, we'll conquer him. Then China will surrender. But Chiang Kai-shek's strategy was defeat but not surrender. So with the end of Shanghai battle, Japan was ready for a Chinese surrounding. No surrounding. So Japan said, okay, if Shanghai is not enough, then we will just take your capital. We go to Nanjing, then we'll see whether you surrender or not. So this is why Japanese soldiers were so brutally killing Japanese soldiers and civilians, raping its women and killing its children, because they were very mad, and they hope to show you this is about the time for you to stop and surrender. But Japan underestimated Chinese nationalism. Japan didn't expect Chinese nationalism would be so strong. Japan at the same time trying to contact the warlord Zhang Fahui in Guangdong, as well as warlords Long Yun in Yunnan, saying that, hey, you stand aside, do not get involved into Chiang Kai-shek's war. It's a war for Chiang Kai-shek, not for you. But warlords like Zhang Fahui, Long Yun, and many others, they hate Chiang Kai-shek. They didn't like Chiang Kai-shek. They fought Chiang Kai-shek. But when facing external invasion, when facing foreign invasion, they were willing to stand for Chiang Kai-shek, stand united against the foreign invasion. So this is something Japanese didn't expect. Japanese underestimate Chinese nationalism. So of course, I didn't mean that Nanjing massacre was okay. No, it was for more a crime. But just try to understand what was really happened. Try to understand the mentality of Japan. And invading China, of course, no matter for Japan's strategy, they always debate about Jin-tun or Tan-shi, swallow Japan or nipple Japan. Swallow Japan is a war. Nipple Japan is divided. Manchuria, northern China, eastern China, southern China, then western China. Divide and rule. So Japan's intention was clear, but they were not ready for a war. So Chiang Kai-shek believed at that moment, after the Hubei specialization, that was the end, the bottom of Chinese tolerance. And because Chinese was trying to be tolerant, trying to keep a low key for so many years, but he said sacrifice and tolerance will not do us any good. And it was almost to the last minute. So this is the stand, this is the line, the bottom line, that we have to stand firm and fight. And he said China's only chance is to fully commit to the resistance. Only this can we, the whole nation, avoid a perish, avoid subjugation. So why he initiated Shanghai battle? I believe that now you have a better idea why Chiang Kai-shek. He could have avoided a war in Shanghai, but he actually initiated the war because his idea, his purpose was number one, trying to change the path of Japan's invasion, force the Japanese to change its attack route. So Japanese soldiers was planning to take Pinghan, Beiping, Pinghan Railway all the way southward to Wuchang, Hankou, and the Sichuan, Chongqing. But Chiang Kai-shek just forced the Japanese to adjust their track by sending their troops to Shanghai. So Japan had to fight from east to west, not from north to south. So change the path of its attack route. And number two, Chiang Kai-shek was trying to attract international attention, hoping that United States, British would interfere. Number three, for the Battle of Shanghai, very important purpose, an important target for Chiang Kai-shek was to secure Wuhan. Why? Because you know, for 1,000 years, you can see for Chinese history, there are only three routes to get into Sichuan. One is from north, from Xinjiang, to get into northern Sichuan. The other one is from Yunnan, Guizhou, south, from the south. But the major route to get into Sichuan is to take Yangtze-jiang, Changjiang to Sichuan. So Chiang Kai-shek and China need time to reallocate its resources, to move thousands of students, to reallocate schools into Sichuan, Chongqing, Kunming, and as well as industry factories, ammunition factories, military troops, etc. So it needed time. So trying to hold Japanese soldiers in Shanghai, Chiang Kai-shek was able to buy 15 months for securing Wuhan. So Wuhan didn't fall into Japan's hand until October 1938. So Chiang Kai-shek was successfully buying 50 months for Chinese people for such a great migration, but of course, at huge expenses. So the first shot was fired at the Marco Polo Bridge incident. This is what we learned from our history book. But the real cost for the Sino-Japanese war into a full-scale engagement is the Battle of Shanghai, 813淞沪之战. And we have to admit that at the outbreak of Shanghai battle in the fall of 1937, Japanese were not ready for a war. China, on the other hand, already had a comprehensive strategy for the war. Japan had intention, they only had intention, but no detailed planning. So this allowed China to gain the upper hand in the beginning of the war. So by taking the time, China was able to do the preparation to move the capital city, the government offices, government documents, schools, high school, universities, students, teachers, all the resources, factories, westward to Sichuan. Japan, unfortunately, fell into China's scheme, changed its path of attack. Mamuro Shigemitsu, Chong Guanghui was named Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was also the person who signed the surrounding documents, Japan's surrounding documents. Chong Guanghui, in his memoir, which published in 1950, entitled Showa's Unrest, 昭和之动乱. In the first chapter, Chong Guanghui wrote, in the Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese military had no comprehensive planning, and the Chinese army led it by the nose. Japanese soldiers were simply led by the Chinese army by the nose. So they've been forced to fight the Battle of Shanghai. They've been forced to change its plan from nibble into swallow. They've been forced to engage into military confrontation in China. And they've been forced to postpone its attack of Soviet Union because they sent so many troops. They sent almost to the most 1 million troops in China. So China's contribution during World War II was huge, tremendous. Chinese soldiers, Chinese people were able to track, able to fight Japanese soldiers, as many as like 1 million Japanese soldiers. during the war. So let's summarize what we've been sharing with. Chiang Kai-shek's two major guiding principles. Number one is to bait the Japanese army to advance westward. To advance westward from the east instead of southward from the north. Number two, the protective war. So in his diary, Kuomintang will never admit such phrases, 败而不祥, because it's really a shame. It's really a loss of faith. Kuomintang were ready to accept defeats one after another, but no surrender. So in his diary, he said, 败而不祥. He said, 败而不祥, defeat but no surrounding. So Japanese they just didn't do what Chiang Kai-shek was doing. After sacrificing so many casualties, sacrificing such resources, what was he doing? What was he trying to lead China to? Chiang Kai-shek at that time, he understood that he could not really engage in real battles with Japanese. But what he could do is trying to drag Japanese army into the huge area of China, trying to postpone the last day of the war, at the same time waiting for international change. And he got it. On the outbreak of the Pearl Harbor incident, America came to China. For so many years, Chiang Kai-shek finally see Western alliance came to China to support China with its war against the Japanese invasion. Shall we stop here or?
Yeah, I think it's about time.
Yes, let's stop here because I could talk for 10 hours, 20 hours. Too many interesting, too many fascinating, challenging findings. Let's stop here, but I just want to share with you the last slide. On October 10th, 1945, it was the day Japan decided to submit their surrounding. But they didn't declare it, but they already telephoned the alliance headquarters saying that we're able to. So let's come and negotiate how we're going to manage the surrounding. So that morning, Chiang Kai-shek was in his office, and he heard firecrackers in American offices, which is just like 100 meters down his office. And so he sent his staff to Muley, saying, "Go down to take a look. What's going on there? Why was it so noisy?" And 5 minutes later, Muley came back, saying, "Wow, good news! Japanese was ready to surrender." Then in the next 20 minutes, the firecrackers, yelling, noise, just all over Chongqing. And Chiang Kai-shek, he did a prayer, and he wrote his diary. He said, "At this time, people in Chongqing were all celebrating the victory. But he said, but in my heart, there is worry and shame. There is no sense of joy. Why?" He said, "Because I expect that the future would just, the future is just arduous. The future would probably 10 times difficulties facing me." Because he already predicted, but actually he knew another war was there already. Thank you.
This is only a very small fraction of the huge treasure in Hoover Institution, and Chiang Kai-shek diary really helped us to change our understanding of the 20th century history of China and also the Far East as a whole. And so she presented some, I think, very interesting, also controversial points, for sure. So the floor is open. Before we open that, I use my privilege as a chair. That's the first question here to her. You mentioned that Soong battle was the beginning of that, and also Nanjing massacre. I read something else about talking about the Nanjing battle. In fact, Japan was not ready to go to Nanjing, and then Chiang Kai-Chek called a military meeting in Nanjing, said, "What should we do next? Should we just move to Sichuan?" There was a general who was a warlord, lost the military power. Then he proposed we should have war here in Nanjing to attract Japan to Nanjing. Then he used the terms that we cannot surrender to Japan at this time. Very, very nationalistic. Then Chiang Kai-Chek could not resist that. So okay, we give the troops withdraw from Shanghai, which was already very tired. Then also students there to hold on Nanjing. Then Japan was tracked to Nanjing, and there was a battle in Nanjing. This military journal, he burned all the books from the Yangtze River that would not withdraw anywhere. Then 2 days after, he just escaped himself.
He escaped.
Yes.
Yes.
What's his name? He then surrendered to China in 1929. 看自己委员。
对对对。
That person. Then that started the whole massacre. Is that
the name will come out, maybe come out later. Then Chiang Kai-shek executed him. Yeah, you're right.
Is there any writing? He said that diary about that part of.
Yes, he was very angry. Well, after the Shanghai battle, and everybody knew the next was Nanjing. Then Chiang Kai-shek pondered to himself, shall we fight in Nanjing? Because Nanjing was a 1,000-year-old ancient capital. If we fought Nanjing, Nanjing would be totally destroyed. Shanghai was a new city. So shall we fight Nanjing? So he hesitated. He said, Nanjing is our capital city. If we don't fight for our capital city, how can I face Chinese people? How can I tell them that I have a strong will to fight against the Japanese? So there were debate among Kuomintang military leaders whether they should have the war be held in Nanjing, or they could actually just escape, just leave. They could leave Nanjing, but the final decision was stay in Nanjing and fight against Japanese invasion. Japanese at that time expect a surrender. Japanese was waiting for a surrender from China, but without any signal, any symptom of surrounding. Japanese was very angry, supportive, disappointed, and frustrated.
Okay, the floor is open. Okay, we'll start here.
Thank you, Dr. Tai Chun Kuo. And I have a question concerning some other possible motive that Chiang Kai-Chek actually engaged. That Chiang Kai-Chek, I said I have another, a possible view, whether he talked about it in his diary or not, that he actually engaged in the war against Japan as a source to, to bring, as a source to actually achieve unity within the country, because if you have now a foreign enemy that can bring all Chinese together, especially the communists and also the lords, and he was hoping, is it possible that he was hoping that he will actually be able to unite the Chinese and then they be able to not to surrender and somehow be able to get help from the West and he'd be the ultimate leader in China. And also concerning his conclusion, why he was not happy that Japan surrendered. Is it because he was hoping that he will be the sole leader? At the same time, that was not the case, because China at the time is still divided between the communists, and that will be another war, communist war with the KMT.
This is an interesting question. You know, I didn't know it until I had a chance to access Chiang Kai-shek diary. Because we always believe that Chiang Kai-shek wants to fight against Chinese communists. He wants to see the end of Chinese communists. He hated, he disliked the Chinese communists. But in his diary, it is the Soviet Union, the Comintern, the Soviet Union behind the Chinese communists, that he really concerned. So even during the war, during the Sino-Japanese war, when Chinese soldiers were fighting against Japanese soldiers, in his diary he said, we are actually fighting for Soviet, we're fighting for Stalin.
That part of history also, there is not new publication about that part. The Soviet spies were in China, trying to help Stalin to make sure that Japan will not attack Soviet Union.
Exactly.
Trying to help that spies were awarded as a national hero by the Stalin after the war.
You know, actually, a lot of history is still waiting to be unveiled.
Okay, Ashura, you have a question?
Okay. It's really, and after we were having, after listening to the whole thing, I think my grandfather was part of the people in the Great Migration at the time, and my dad was probably in the army at the time, I guess. I'm not really familiar with this period of history, so it's kind of very heavy when I learn something from this kind of a different perspective. However, I do have kind of two questions. I'm not sure if the second one right now. But the first question is, I'm from Taiwan, but I'm very curious why the history book in the normal education, let's put it that way, does not really present this part in a very clear way. That's kind of my puzzle, because I think I'm very weak at this part of history when I was in the middle school or high school. And the second question is actually related to this lecture. Is about, I'm curious about when did John realize that Soviet Russia is not a reliable ally, whether it's before he prepared the strategy to kind of provoke Japan in a skillful way, or he realized afterwards. Because I think 1937 is kind of an interesting timing. Why he thought it was a good timing to, because I'm not sure whether he felt China was well prepared at the time. So I'm just curious.
Where are you from?
From Taiwan.
You're lucky from Taiwan. If you were from China, and the history book is very simple. You know, it's such a regret that the history books or textbooks that we have being impartial or even distorted, especially the history documents, the history books published or circulated in China. And this is why, with the evolution of new documents, first-hand documents, people now begin to really understand what was really going on at that time. So the evaluation, so the opening of such documents help people really get to know the interactions between political leaders, getting to know the interaction between states, and getting to know what was really there in the leader's mind. And this is why we have a grant project ongoing at Hoover Institution, together with 16 scholars from Taiwan, United States, and China, mainland China, and Japan. 4 scholars from Japan. We are now writing a history of Sino-Japanese war, trying to write an objective, impartial history, trying to present records which is close to the truth for our readers. But it's just the beginning, with the evolution, with the opening of the documents, it's just the beginning. People just begin to know this. Like what I have just shared with you was also a shock for myself. It was a shock. From my childhood, I've been told that Japanese want to fight. They were brutally killed Chinese soldiers and civilians. Japanese invaded Shanghai twice, etc., etc. But as I grew up and I have access to many other documents, and especially Chiang Kai-shek diaries, then I begin to learn. It's a new understanding, a new interpretation for history of modern China. And the second question is Chiang Kai-shek's attitude toward Soviet. He knew Soviet very well. In 1923, he was sent by Dr. Sun Yat-sen to Moscow as the leader of a military delegation to visit Moscow. Before the trip, he had illusion. He learned Russian language, he read Marx Leninist writings, and he had illusion about communist society. But Chiang Kai-shek was, I have to admit, he was smart. He is a person with observation.
He was almost handsome, but smart.
He was smart. You can tell from his diary, you can tell from his grand strategy. He was smart. And he wrote in his diary, he said, we've been told that the laborers are having a great life here. But how come the laborers I met this morning, they had a miserable life? We've been told that minorities being respected. All peoples were equal in Soviet. But how come what I found it was not true? And he had conversation with Soviet military leaders, and Chiang Kai-shek said, so Kuomintang, that was before the Northern Expedition. So Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek would think about Northern Expedition. So he said, Kuomintang should have a military station in Mongol and Xinjiang, because by so doing we could fight northward and southward and to conquer Beijing and Zhongyuan, Henan, Hebei, etc. But right after he said this, it was just a conversation. Right after he said this, one Soviet general just embarrassed him in front of the public, saying that you're wrong. And you Chinese should focus on political affairs now. Don't think about any military maneuverings. And number two, I tell you, people in Xinjiang and Tibet, Mongolia, they don't like Chinese, they don't like Han-Ren. So there's no way for Kuomintang to have its military stations in Mongolia or Xinjiang. So that day, when Chiang Kai-shek returned to his hotel, he wrote in his diary, he said, why the general was so rude. He could have told me privately. Why did he want to embarrass me, humiliate me in front of all the guests? And what was the intention of Soviet military? I think, now I begin to think that what they really want to do is to support a puppet communist regime in China. They don't care about China's modernization. So as early as 1923, so don't be misled when I said Chiang Kai-shek was waiting for Soviet intervention. Chiang Kai-shek was aiming for Soviet support. He needs Soviet support because that's the only resource he could ask for. America at that time didn't care about what was happening in the East. In England, Britain, they didn't care. So Soviet was the only sources that Chiang Kai-shek could possibly ask for. But at the same time, he wrote in his diary that we are actually fighting the Japanese for the Soviets. This is why he later published 苏俄在中国, The Soviets in China.
Yeah, same story there in the Korean War. Communist Party
Yes.
passed the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
But they did not
Exactly.
deliver what they promised.
Yeah, look what happened at the Yalta
Yeah.
accord.
Okay, you have a question here?
She covered what I was asking on the second question.
Okay, so let's go back, then come to you. Yeah.
Really quick. So you said he was putting entries daily. What was he? Did he have his diary with him in the cave in Xi'an when he was kidnapped? What was going on then?
Diaries of Xi'an
Well,
incident?
yeah, when he was kidnapped or when he fled into the mountains to hide in the cave.
Well, that was only one night.
Oh, okay. He got back in time.
That was only one night.
Okay, here.
My own family had an indirect link to this, and my mother's cousin, who was younger than she was out of high school a pilot that flew over the hump into Western China.
Yes.
And he flew over 100 flights and later became an engineer out here at Martin Marietta in Denver. But my question is on that, what recognition did Chiang Kai-shek make with the American involvement in resupply on the west side of China? Was that addressed in his diaries?
Oh, yes, a lot. A lot. The hub is Tuofeng. Tuofeng, that was after the Eastern Coast were blockaded by Japanese and the Burma Road were closed. So the hub at that time was the only route that China could have resources coming. And Chiang Kai-shek appreciate very much American support. American soldiers like General Doolittle, the general who bombed Tokyo. After the bombing, and General Doolittle and his fellows landed in China. And you know this? It's similar like American soldiers who participated into the transportation of the hump. Chiang Kai-shek gave them great praise. He admired a lot. But for the leaders, Chiang Kai-shek criticized American leaders. For example, General Stilwell. Sometimes he loved Roosevelt, but sometimes he criticized. He claimed that Roosevelt was just playing the game. But anyways, the hub did great contribution. That was very important. And he wrote, and many in his diary, he once visited India through the hub with Madame Chiang Kai-shek.
Yeah, can I ask a second question?
Just brief, yeah.
Since the Germans helped advise in China, was there any concern that they later gave that information to the Japanese since they were connected to the Axis? Did they tell the Japanese about what they consulted on and advised about?
That I don't know. But at the outbreak of Sino-Japanese War in 1937, Hitler was trying to persuade Chiang Kai-shek to unite with Germany. In Chiang's diary, he thought about it, he calculated, pondered, but then he decided not to stay with Germany. But thank God he made the right decision.
Okay, last question from Xiao.
Yes, I'm from China, and as you said, I heard it's about negative comment about KMT, and also I heard lots of versions about this kind of history. I'm kind of confused. I just want to know, according to his diary, is there any real cooperation between non-KMT warlords and the Communist Party? The real cooperation, not just to shake hands or send up documents, the real cooperation.
You mean cooperation of what?
Against Japan.
Oh. Yes, indeed. Well, when I say some history of Sino-Japanese War being distorted, I actually mean the history written by Chinese communists. Because Chinese communists always say, it is the communists who fight the war. But it's ridiculous, right? Communists stationed in Yan'an, in Northwest. How could you fight all the way to Shanghai? In a dream only. And look at those hundreds of battles. Millions of soldiers, generals died. during the war. According to data, there are 220 generals died during the war. Only 2 were communists. So that explains who fought the war. So we don't need to waste our time for that. But I didn't mean that all the communists were like Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong at the time, during the war, he was in Yan'an calculating, planning how to save the communists and trying to take the chance to expand communist influence. But many communist soldiers, they fought. They really mean to fight. They really mean to fight the Japanese invasion.
Okay.
So in our book, I think, I hope we'll have a balanced report, a balanced analysis. And we invited 2 Chinese scholars to participate in this project. And one asked to be anonymous, because he said, only by so doing I could write honestly. I could say what I really want to say. But I asked them to show the data, that how many Japanese they killed, how many battles they really get involved. We have to give them the credit. We have to give the communist soldiers the credits for the war.
Okay. So, before end, I think one last question from me. Because I think otherwise it will be not complete either. You talk the Chinese scholars drawing this research.
Yes.
He asked the anonymous, 不要用自己的名字。
匿名。
匿名, yes. In that context, you have gone to China a lot. I mean, Dr. Kuo has been invited by Chinese universities, Chinese government, to give lectures in China a lot. So how the Chinese people, Chinese scholars in China, when you went to China, respond to what you present on this part of history?
I think this is the sorrow of Chinese scholars, if they really want to be real scholars. Hundreds of Chinese scholars coming to Hoover Institution, coming to read and use our documents. Private talks, they are no different as ours. They all knew, because they have their judgment. But when they went back to China, when they publish their writings, they have to be cautious. They always say, 我们必须有分寸. We have to know the limit. We have to be careful. But I believe that the day will come. We don't know when, but the day will come that in China scholars will will be free to write whatever they really
But
think.
when you talk about the response in China,
Of course, they have their judgment. I show them the evidence. Like, any of you disagree? Any of you will challenge the evidence that I presented? Evidence talk.
okay, with the evidence talks. Let's conclude this, I think, fabulous talk. Please join me and thank Dr. Kuo. For this quarter, one is on the 29th, we have a China Town Hall meeting, and then we have a Chinese artist delegation in November. So look for our announcements. Okay, have a good weekend.